Thanks everyone for joining. I think we're going to get started with today's transit talk. Welcome. We really appreciate your time today. It's been amazing to see the interest in today's transit chat topic, which is a just recovery will take transit. Just a quick introduction. My name is Kelsey Mesher. I'm the Deputy Director of Transportation Choices Coalition. For those of you who are not familiar with us, Transportation Choices is a policy and advocacy organization in Washington State. We're working to bring more and better transportation options that are healthy, sustainable, and accessible. We are very excited today to be co-hosting the Transit Talk with TransitCenter, an organization based in New York. TransitCenter works to improve transit in order to make cities more just and environmentally sustainable. They do grant making, research, provide technical assistance, they run programs, and they do advocacy. They are currently playing a pivotal role in leading and organizing transit advocates across the country. So we are really happy to be co-hosting with TransitCenter and excited to have a lot of folks tuning in from across the country today. I also want to give a big shout out to our sponsor for today's transit talk, which is Amazon. So thank you, Amazon. Transportation Choices would like to take a moment to acknowledge that while we are gathering here virtually, our panel is joining us from unceded lands across the US. We are calling in from tribal land of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish, the ancestral lands of the Lenape people, and the ancestral lands of the Kickapoo, Peoria, and Potawatomi, which is present day, as we know it, Chicago. We are dropping a resource in the chat. We invite you to learn about what land you are on, and we welcome you to acknowledge it. Indigenous people are still here, many of whom, like the Duwamish, are still fighting for federal recognition. Mobility for all cannot be achieved without recognizing those that first navigated these spaces. As we work towards building a more accessible world, let us honor the physical spaces we occupy and the Native communities past, present, and future that live and thrive here. Finally, just wanted to do a couple of logistical announcements. First, we've enabled the chat feature in this webinar. We wanted to make it more interactive, so please use the chat to ask questions and to expand on discussion topics. Of course, be respectful of the panelists and of each other. Questions can also be submitted directly to panelists, and we will have TCC staff sorting through the questions. We'll answer as many as we can, both during the talk and at the end. The entire talk will be recorded and we'll be providing a link. And then finally, we have enabled captions for this talk. And if you would like to show or hide the subtitles, you may do so using the options at the bottom of your Zoom screen under live transcript. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. I'm thrilled we can hear from 3 experts representing different perspectives in this important discussion. We have Richard DeSam Lazaro, Senior Manager of Government and Community North America at Expedia Group, Chris O'Clair, the Mobility Division Director of King County Metro Transit, which is based in Seattle and King County, and Chris Van Eyken, Senior Program Associate at TransitCenter. And so before we dive into questions, I wanted to invite the panelists to say a bit more about themselves and to offer the perspective that they're bringing to today's discussion. Why don't we go in that same order? Richard, Chris O'Clair, and Chris Van Eyken.
Thanks, Kelsey, and hi, everybody. It's an honor to be with you today. As Kelsey said, I'm Richard. I run Expedia Group state and local engagement across 3 countries of North America, and most recently helped manage our government affairs and community relations as relates to Expedia's headquarters relocation from the east side of King County to downtown Seattle, or what is at least close to downtown Seattle. So I'm also proud to be a member of the board of Transportation Choices Coalition and really grateful for y'all's time today.
Thank you so much, Kelsey and everyone. It's a privilege to be here today. My name is Chris O'Clair, and I get the fortune of being part of King County Metro. As the Mobility Division Director, I oversee the preparing and planning for the system, the gathering and collection of getting people onto the system, the incentivizing them, and then really getting the information out to the customers. But this past year has been a real journey for us at Metro. For those of you who are not local, King County Metro is one of the top 10 largest transit agencies in the country and has traditionally been known for its huge ridership growth that we've seen in the past 10 years. And as we've gone through this journey, we've learned a lot and we've transformed. I'm really excited to talk about what we've gone through and where we're going to in the future.
Hi, I'm Chris Van Eyken. I am a Senior Program Associate at TransitCenter. As stated earlier, we're New York based, but nationally focused. I sit on our reforming agency practice team where we develop best practice research. We share best practices across agencies. We do our best to keep in touch with trends across the industry and try to identify what direction different agencies are going towards, especially now during COVID-19, as we have had lots of disruption in the past year. So we've done our best to distill what other agencies are doing and try to pull out some lessons, and I hope we can share some today.
Fantastic. Let's get into it. I want to start with safety. It's one of the most important things. Throughout the last year, public health guidelines and our understanding of safety have evolved as scientific evidence and research on COVID has become more available. Agencies have adapted how and when they are providing service to balance loads. Riders have been asked to mask up and distance. The pandemic has also influenced the broader urban environment and transit access. So let's start by talking about safety. What do we actually know about the safety of riding transit, perhaps versus the perceptions that may be out there? How are agencies and employers addressing both those actual and perceived risks? And finally, what have we heard from riders and operators that have never stopped using the system? Why don't we start with Chris V?
Yeah, so I would say that last year, COVID came on very quickly. Agencies were just doing their best to make sure their passengers and their operators were safe. So pretty much across the board, mask wearing was required. Many systems cut back on fare collection so we could have rear door boarding and create some separation between passengers and operators. Distancing requirements were implemented. And these were all meant to reduce the risk of transmission on public transit. And I think it was the right call at the time. With the information we had, we just, had to take some action to make sure everyone was safe. But over time, we've found that some of these actions were they were effective in preventing transmission, but they weren't key. So going forward, it might be time to start pulling back on some of those and thinking of new ways to protect passengers. And research has supported that. It's found a report that Sam Schwartz conducted last year on behalf of APTA found that basically transmission on public transit was very low. Transit vehicles have not the best ventilation, but it's typically better than your average restaurant. And so air circulates many times and it prevents strong cases of transmission that you may see with large groups of unmasked people. So some of the social distancing requirements that have been in effect over the last year, while they made sense at the time, we start to see them relaxed. And that's had an effect of adding capacity to our transit system. Masking still, I think, talking to the perception of safety, we did some survey work last year that found, like, above and beyond anything, just seeing the presence of masked people on transit made people feel safer and more likely to continue to ride transit vehicles. So I think the guidance, I believe it's an FTA mandate, that we continue to wear masks through September, even in cities that have high vaccination rates, is probably a smart one. It doesn't put a large burden on transit systems other than there is a safety factor there. Operators had negative interactions with passengers and trying to enforce that. So there's still need for a balance there, but keeping mask mandates temporarily for the time being is a good call, I believe. Yeah, I think other than that, I think that's it for now.
I appreciate that, Chris. I'll just follow up just to back up and say King County Metro, just to give everyone context, delivered about 450,000 trips a day. So just think about that. A lot of people moving throughout the system. And as the pandemic hit, we were brought down fairly severely to almost the lowest, I think, was about 75,000 trips per day. And I really want to state that what we put in the forefront of this is safety. And I loved, Kelsey, how you asked, what does safety mean, not just for our customers, but also for our operators? And I'm going to expand that for all those folks that maintain and prepare our system, clean our facilities, all those essential workers that were in the front line. I've had the fortune of being able to work from home, and that is not true of most of King County Metro. So really, I want to state that King County Metro took this opportunity to not let a good crisis go to waste and really understand how to transform our agency and putting in the proper protections for our frontline employees and making sure we did that. We actually changed a lot of structures on how we make decisions in Metro. Really proud of the work that my colleagues did, and really thinking about how we can make decisions quickly. Public agencies are not known for that. And really, I think we've proven we can do it, and that we can do it in a real meaningful way where we listen from the ground of those who are on the front line and really help bring those voices to the leadership levels of where we need to understand risk, costs, and all of the complexity that comes around that. I do want to state that as we look at the future, what we are hearing in terms of safety is that we need to continue to lean into this. And Chris, I really am glad you said, the importance of keeping that safety as we're opening up. I have a young children, one who's not vaccinated, and we rode on this weekend downtown on the rapid ride, and he felt okay because everyone was masked. And so not everyone can get vaccinated, and we need to make sure that we build a really safe environment around us for our operators and customers. So just to let everyone know on the call, there's so much we're doing on increasing our cleaning and sanitization. We now have automatic partitions for our drivers. We have mask dispensers on every coach. We upgraded our filters on our coaches, and we open our windows. That airflow, Chris, that you were talking about is so critical. It's actually proven that it's better than being in a building or a restaurant or a school, because we have windows that the airflow is moving through the system. And that we're closing down seats as our load capacities are limited. We hope to lift those load capacities because that's how we're going to be able to deliver more people. And I think that that's really critical. And how can we do it so that we're ensuring that safety on our service for everyone? The future, though, in my mind, is not just about safety on our buses and with COVID. The future is really about safety of our entire system as we're waiting and preparing and coming into the system. And the complexity of that around not just COVID, but around what is happening in our environment, on the homelessness and the needs in our community, and really leaning in with compassion to understand how we can support all of our community needs while building a safe place for people to wait and to gather and to collect into our system is one of the biggest challenges we see as the next chapter opens. As we look into the future, partnering with cities, private sector, and others to build that so that everyone has a voice, that everyone has a place in this community, and making sure that we do it with respect and leading with just love and compassion is one of the challenges we're going to face.
Thanks, Chris and Chris. So Expedia is an online travel agency, and that doesn't really give us. We're not public health experts. We're not we're not a transit agency, and so we've really seen our role and the role of many employers not so much as attempting to sort of surrogate a public health expertise, but to augment and validate the expertise of folks like Chris and King County Public Health and others who know the safety of riding transit. And there are a couple ways that we've done that. And I'll note that a lot of what I'll say today is built on the commute program that was put together by Expedia's commute team from Nelson Nygaard, and I'll drop a link to a case study about its efficacy in the chat shortly. But we were able, over the course of the last 5 years, to reduce single occupancy commutes from 58% of our employees in 2015, I think 38 in 2018, to 13 in pre-pandemic 2020. And that we built that by establishing an amount of trust and credibility with our employees and our commute team that is really operative right now. And so what we're doing is rebooting our transit program in full. And that is really, really creating this understanding among our employee base, Expedia feels like it's time. And if we feel like it's time, they have that trust in us to get back on into their transit commute habits. And we're cognizant of the fact that it's been a long year and people have broken some of those habits and for good reason. And we want to be respectful of everybody, to Chris O's point, of everybody's health situation and level of comfort. So there is flexibility built in. But one of the things we do well is one-on-one coaching. Anybody at Expedia Group, whether they're a senior exec or an entry-level employee or even a contractor, a third-party vendor, is eligible for one-on-one commute coaching. Tell us what your day looks like and we'll figure out how to get you here. And what our commute team has found is when people do have that hesitancy around safety, what's most impactful for them is honestly a personal anecdote, right? I mean, I've heard from our commute team, yeah, I ride, here's what it looks like. It's actually really remarkable. It feels comfortable. Everyone's wearing a mask. And that's the sort of interpersonal trust that brings people back into ridership.
Thank you so much. I don't know if my staff can help me out here, but we have been collecting those rider stories throughout this month, which is Ride Transit Month in Washington. So if you do have a story about riding transit to share, we would love to collect that from you. Our next question is about our timeline of both going back to work and sort of the impacts to the transportation system in coordination with that. People who have worked remotely for the last year everyone is having conversations with their employers about returning to the physical space. Everyone from Expedia, large employers, to teeny tiny nonprofits like Transportation Choices, we are talking about when are we going back, how are we going back, and sometimes whether or not we're going to go back to the physical office at all. All of these decisions impact our transportation system. What are you hearing about or telling folks about when we're going back to the office? Are employers coordinating with each other and with the transit agencies, both in King County, in the Seattle or Washington State realm, or across the country? Are folks sharing information? And what are you expecting in terms of demand for transit versus other modes? I know, Richard, you sort of started getting into this, but wondering what that return to transit and the sort of return of transit looks like.
Yeah. I mean, we are really privileged as sort of Puget Sound area employers to follow the lead of our transit agencies in a lot of ways. And that's not only because of King County Metro's expertise and their leadership, but because of the regional coordination across agencies. And I'm not trying to throw shade at other parts of the country. I'm sure like our folks in Silicon Valley would be, the agency would be the first to say that they would love to be better coordinated in this regard. And so we're very fortunate to be informing agencies like Metro about our return to work plan, which for what it's worth, it sounds like we're all going to be back in the office on Tuesday and Thursday and a third day of our choosing. And how that will impact peak times and how, we just have to be in the office if we want to be. And so we expect there will be a lot of testing and learning with commute options. We're also seeing that where pre-pandemic, we had rides that were multi-use. Someone might ride to work a day, ride to the grocery store, go pick up a family member, ride home. Right now, we're seeing more interest in ride to work, ride home, figure out the rest of your day. And so it's hard to tell what the transit impact of return to work will be, but it's really, really fortunate that we're able to say with our employee shuttles, for instance, which are first and last mile from around the King County, Snohomish, Pierce region to Seattle transit hubs, we'll follow Metro's lead and go 70% capacity until, Chris, as you mentioned, that changes. So there is a lot of coordination through Challenge Seattle. Metro themselves are doing a lot of that coordination. And, to be honest with you, because of that leadership from the agencies, the coordination between employers is largely just, are we keeping up with the Joneses, making sure that we are continuing to compete, because transit commutes were seen as a employee amenity pre-pandemic, and they will soon be again.
Thanks. Yeah, Chris, do you want to follow up on, especially?
Yeah,
on the...
I'll follow up on it. Richard, it's so great to hear the work that you do with your employees, but also that you are really just valuing the transit aspect and the connection. And I just want to echo, that's Expedia. And we are really fortunate to live in a region that it's not just Expedia. And just to back up a second for those of you, once again, that don't live in this region, we have one of the largest employer pass programs in the country. We bring in over $200 million, we did, of fare revenue, and over half of that came from employers purchasing passes for their people. And it's that buy-in, the fact that it's a benefit. It's just like healthcare, right? Commuting, connecting into the system and getting into work is part of one of your benefits. As we look to the future, we know that every major employer has re-signed on to an employer pass program, and really proud to say that. They might not be using it as much because we charge them based on the number of boardings, but they're all buying into it. And what we're also hearing is that employers have traditionally bought into purchasing surface, to helping us with the largest van pool program in the country, to building incentive programs like Richard was speaking about here, really to change the way our transportation system works, because that builds the economy. That partnership together is really how we're going to allow the region to thrive. But what we're looking into in the future is that coordination that Richard talked about. It is a challenging time on how to get that message out, that resonates with employers, especially, right? We're trying to say we are safe, but what else do you need in order to ensure that that safety is there? So we're working with the Challenge Seattle, the DSA, the BTAs, the TMAs, et cetera. We have a variety of contact information. We have quarterly meetings we do with the large employers, and it's good to hear from Richard that it maybe is working, especially with those large employers. But I want to recognize that we are also taking the opportunity to transform our organization. We've talked so much about the pandemic, but really is also about building down some of the structures that have been put in place, some of the racial inequities that have been put in place, and really looking at our employer program as really the haves in many ways, and then those who have to pay personally. So we are starting a bunch of new programs, pretty proud of, at looking at small business initiatives, really piloting efforts for those small businesses that can't afford it. How do we share that cost together? How do we look at some of the businesses that are represented by our woman-owned multiracial, multi-ethnic groups that we really want to make sure get the same benefits and incentives. We're also looking at working with a bunch of property managers to provide transit benefits to their tenants, because their tenants might be the smaller coffee shop, the one-off. How can they group those together and share some of the costs associated with this? And really looking at some of the large employers to say, maybe you can give passes to everyone, not just to those who work in downtown and offices. How are you giving it to some of your distribution centers? How are you giving it to some of the people that are doing some more of your service work and cleaning your facilities in other ways? That is where we want to make sure we're working with employers to bring our values and to really center where we're going to go at the future. The last thing I want to say is that people used to use our system, King County Metro and many of the other transit benefits during the commute time period. We are now getting out to people like myself to try to get incentivize people to use it midday, weekends, nights, other ways. And I hope and look forward to employers also continuing that benefit. Employers should be looking at it much like healthcare. So it's not just paying for your commute trip, but really saying owning a transit pass is a benefit to you as a person so that you can ride it anytime and get to where you need. And that's a great benefit to our economy and our environment.
Yeah, I think King County's partnership with the downtown businesses and across the region is a real model for other agencies. I think having that at this moment in time is like a huge advantage for you going forward. A lot of agencies don't have the data or the models because this is such a unique situation to help them think about demand going forward. And that you have established relationships that allow you to think about when people may be going back to the office and what their demand patterns might look like is huge, because so many agencies are struggling right now to weigh how much service should they be restoring, how much should they be holding back resource wise, so that a year or two from now, when maybe if demand doesn't come back and there's a budget crunch, they don't find themselves in trouble all of a sudden. So just having that information is great, and I wish more agencies would try to develop relationships of this type.
Thank you so much. I want to dig a little bit deeper on this topic of service recovery and changes in ridership. We learned a lot about ridership during the pandemic. On the one hand, we saw people almost stop riding completely on many of the peak commuter routes, but on other routes, people continuing to ride just as regularly as often, especially essential workers, people who rely exclusively on transit, and historically, and those communities have been found to be disproportionately communities of color. We know that these communities historically have often received less transit investment. And so now that we have this sort of unequivocal information about who is relying on transit, how do we emphasize equity as we recover service? And how are our agencies looking to do this, both in King County and the Puget Sound as well as elsewhere? Are there fare box implications for a more equitable recovery in service? How do you balance that? And then the question of this sort of flattening the peak period demand. Will we come back to a peak period demand, or has this changed for good? And how are agencies meeting the challenge where demand has changed? What are the benefits to shifting service delivery? So a lot to unpack there, but I think these are some of the core questions that are really going to shape the future of how we're riding and delivering transit service. And yeah, I think maybe starting with Chris. So Claire on this one?
Yeah, thanks, Kelsey. This is a big question, and I hope I touch on all the points. And I thank you for asking it with equity first. Before I dive into that, I always like to give the context and just to state this again. We had about 450,000 trips a day. I was really proud to be part of our monthly business review today, where our staff reported out that we're at about 150,000 boardings actual today, and we're at the highest since COVID. And one of the things that we are committed to is rebuilding that ridership, rebuilding it back, but really understanding where the needs are greatest and how to rebuild it back. It's really a fascinating time as we at King County Metro are working to bring forth new policies based on our mobility equity cabinet that I was just attending at the noon hour with some of the TCC representatives, and learning on how we need to center our choices around equity and sustainability and safety, the foundation of who we are. And this time period in the pandemic has taught us a lot. Kelsey, you said it well. We have learned where our needs are greatest. We have learned that a lot of our routes actually retained ridership. And so just to give you some of the examples, we know that a lot of our South King County routes, we saw ridership retention of about 75%. That actually means that with the reduced capacity on buses, we actually had to add more coaches to the system to meet that demand because we were leaving people on the street. And then some of our areas that are more traditionally peak period where people can work from home, we saw a ridership retention of about 20%. And we even canceled a large majority of those peak period routes just not to deliver them so that we could save those resources and deliver them in our areas where we have communities of color, low-income immigrant communities, is where we know now, not just from data from our census information, but from actual ridership or how people are using the system. I think one of the biggest elements of this is that the system will look different as we bring it back. We know that King County Metro has been traditionally what I like to call very peak heavy. For those of you not in the transit industry, what that does to the system is that during those peak periods, we have to build capacity for our coaches, our bases, our employees, et cetera. And then in the middle of the day, in the nights and weekends, we haven't had as much ridership. And what we are seeing actually in the pandemic is much of the retention was not just in these areas of greatest need, but also in that midday, nights and weekends. People that are dependent on the service all the time are using the service, and we hope to build that system back so that we can provide that frequency, that reliability, the ability to show up and go in the middle of the day. So that way you can choose transit first. For those of you who aren't aware, King County Metro is based on a traditional hub and spoke system, where the downtown Seattle is the core, and we've been bringing people in from the neighboring areas into the Seattle area or the University of Washington. But we know as the region grows, as Bellevue and Renton and Federal Way are growing, all these cities, we have 39 jurisdictions in King County, are growing, that really the connection between the regional hubs is most critical now. We want to build that more integrated web. And now through the pandemic, we've seen that need where it's not just connecting people to downtown, the demand is there to connect people between regional centers, and not just at the peak periods, during the shift works, connecting people possibly to services, to medical appointments, etc. When we are looking at the future, I think it's really important that we also understand that it's providing the service is important, but making sure people can actually pay for the service. During the pandemic, we launched our subsidized ORCA program, where people that make 80% of the federal poverty income level now can connect with a social service agency and get a free annual pass. It's a big deal. People that make 200% of the federal poverty level can get an ORCA lift, which is a reduced rate. So looking at service, but also looking at these other barriers, whether it's ability to pay, just even understanding of the system. We're working hard to translate our information, and then really connecting with communities, paying community-based organizations to give us information on what riders need, is where we're really trying to understand on how to build back the system. I will say we've demonstrated this at King County Metro. I'm really proud of this. We've demonstrated it during the pandemic. We built back our Renton Kent Auburn project, and we brought back 80,000 hours of service and built on what wasn't there, even when we had a reduced system. We committed to an area that we know is of need, as we're looking at the future through our R-Camp project, and making sure that those hours were brought into the system and brought more into that South King County area. Another example of this is with our Northgate work, that as we're restructuring on Northgate, really understanding and demonstrating where our communities, our needs are, and really making sure that we make fast, frequent east-west connections into Northgate, but also understanding that communities of need are throughout the county, and that we need to make sure that they're connecting to that regional system throughout the county. This challenge is moving forward as we adopt our policies, as we recover our system. We will be asking more and more questions about, should we restructure it? How should we look at it differently? And I'm excited to do it with our partners in order to make sure we deliver where our needs are greatest.
Well, there's a lot here. I mean, that's a tough act to follow, Chriso and Kelsey. That's a lot in your question. So I'll try to focus narrowly on the question of how do we recover transit with equity goals in mind, as narrowly as I could in that broad space. And I think this is a really cool opportunity for folks in the regional employer community, because we're having these two conversations that seem distinct but aren't right now. One is like, where are we working, and where do we need to be working, and how do you transport people between the two? And the other is the inclusion and diversity question. Who is our workforce, and is that representative of the communities in which we work and where we serve? And as we address one question, one sort of feeds into the other. And so I think there are two ways for an employer, as I see it, to sort of just bring those two together. One is internal, and that's making sure that you do have that robust transit benefit. And that for us means we actually, in addition to paying for your transit pass, and certainly not limited to commutes, you can use it for whatever. If you take a non-SOV commute to Expedia's campus, you get $5 a day. Whereas if you drive yourself and park, you are charged daily. There's no monthly parking, there's no hourly parking, you pay your money. And so there's that sort of carrot and stick approach, but those carrots are available at all levels of the company, and not just for our employees, but for vendors, the folks who will work in cafes that are located in our campus, or are on the custodial or facility staff. All these people can expect these same benefits. And so there's that internal work that we as employers are obliged to do in this moment, and must. Externally, there's the advocacy, and there's the championship, I think, of ridership and investment in transit that is at this point a mandate, and that can look like fare box intervention. And certainly, as Chris noted, there's a lot of really good work that's already going on in the region, and there's a lot of benefit to thinking about sort of that cost as a barrier for folks into the workforce. But in my mind, it is almost more pressing in many ways to address coverage and frequency, because a free bus does you no good if it's 8 blocks away and runs once every 30 minutes, particularly if you're a working parent. And I think that's where this working parents and working families is where this conversation gets a lot bigger, particularly for underrepresented and marginalized communities. How good is a frequent and close by bus if it's not also frequent and close by to childcare or grocery stores or medical facilities, whatever you may need. And I will take a moment to shout out the panel sponsor, Amazon, for making a significant announcement this morning with regard to a $100 million investment in transit-oriented development. This conversation gets really big, really fast, because it's not just about where's the bus or where's the light rail. It's about where do I live and where are the things that I need? And then it becomes about how easy is it for me to get to work. And if we can answer that question in a satisfactory way for folks that we've systemically locked out of our economy for many generations, like, that's really cool work. That's how you bring those conversations together. So there's a public policy imperative here as well for employers.
Thank you. Chris B, what's resonating with you in terms of what you see in other cities and areas?
Yeah, over the last year, there's been a lot of effort to make sure across the country that essential workers and communities of color, where people have continued to commute across all times, that they have enough service to safely ride the system. And I hope as we start to open back up and folks start heading back to their offices, that we remember that a lot of those people are still going to be riding transit, and we have to ensure that we're not taking away resources where they were added to chase after some of the white collar folks that have much more of an opportunity to stay at home. And I'm not saying we shouldn't give those communities the transit service that they require, but it shouldn't come at the cost of people that are riding off peak, for instance, or in neighborhoods that aren't very well connected. Those folks were struggling to get to their workplaces on time pre-pandemic, and we can't forget them just because this crisis passed. It was a crisis for them before we started COVID service protocols, and it will continue to be after if we don't continue to run frequent service in those neighborhoods and ensure those people have safe connections to their jobs.
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you, Richard, for also broadening the conversation and making that connection between equity in the workforce and in our workplaces and transportation equity, obviously inextricably linked. I have one more prepared question for you, and then I don't think folks can see, but there's more than 140 people here watching, so we're getting a ton of questions. So we're going to do one more prepared question for me and then move to audience questions. So I want to talk about lasting change and what transformation you think might come from this moment. What trends or changes do you expect to live on in terms of remote or versus in-person work? How do we pay and fund for transit? Is that changing because of the pandemic and our recovery? And in the months ahead, what should we be thinking about in terms of how our systems work and how they could work differently to benefit all? And I'll start with Chris V on this question.
Yeah, there's a lot there, but I'll start with how remote work could impact. I think it's really going to change people's schedules. It's not just that folks aren't going to be going to the office, they could be going at different times and for different lengths each day. And they might commute some weekends and fewer times during the week. And the key here is, I think, to remember that though there is a lot of uncertainty going forward, transit agencies are aware of the tools that we have to sort of meet these new demands. We can move towards more frequent all-day schedules, which was a trend pre-pandemic, where you think about service being consistent across the day. So folks aren't showing up at 2 p.m., for instance, and waiting an hour for a bus. At least every 15 minutes, there should be a bus, even in between peaks. I think spreading out service across the day so that we're not chasing peaks anymore, which we might not have to because of changes in demand, can create more equitable systems that better serve all types of riders, including non-commute trips. And in terms of, you mentioned new fare products, I think that's going to be a challenge for a lot of agencies. I think a lot of agencies depend upon their unlimited passes, their 7-day passes, their monthly passes to generate revenue. And if people aren't going in 5 days a week as they did before, those revenues will dry up. They'll become more just one-off pays when people do go in. So I think agencies need to think smartly about new sources of not only fare revenue, but other sources of revenue. For instance, Metro in Chicago has, as of, I believe, June of last year, moved to using a day pass. Before that, they used mostly monthly and weekly passes, but the day pass gives riders an opportunity to ride 2 or 3 times a day. And it seems like they don't have strong data yet to back it up, but it seems to be a very popular option because people can use the system more frequently for a good price. I think other than finding new models like that, we also need to think about non-fare revenue. So here in New York, we have congestion pricing coming on board, hopefully in the next few years. I know a lot of other agencies are talking to their DOT or their city managers about this because DOTs are very concerned about everyone jumping in their car at the end of the pandemic to start doing their commute trips. And so demand management is going to have to be not only let's get people back on transit using carrots, but maybe employing a few sticks to ensure that people don't go back towards the unsustainable single occupancy vehicle and clog our streets up and contribute to the next crisis in terms of climate change.
I can go, but I don't have a ton to add except this. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what's going to stick as we recover, Kelsey. But I mean, I think what's exciting is that we have a rebuilding opportunity, and I think we are more conscious of what we value and why than we've been before. And over the last year, we've had windows, these sort of like these Zoom windows into each other's lives and homes, and where, you know, prior to March of last year, we built commute and work and where we work. We built our lives around that, right? I have to be there at a certain time until a certain time, and I'll come home and I'll figure out how to make the rest work around that. And now I think we're building a world in which all of those things are built around our lives. I can't be in the office until 10 because, as you know, I have to go figure out childcare, as you know. And so there's this really, really exciting and broad opportunity for all of us, especially I think employers, to rebuild a culture of work and a structure of work that is sort of democratized in a lot of ways, democratized in our schedules, democratized in decision making. It's exciting.
Wow, Richard, you're absolutely right. I get the privilege of leading a division that I have gotten to know in such a new and compassionate way as I'm hearing my young son run up the stairs, heading off to the next class. I hope we, as a culture and a community, can just really lean in with some of that empathy. Getting to know each other in a new way has been a real treat as a leader. But when you ask about what's the lasting change of King County Metro, I've talked about a few of the small things about how we've been able to been so nimble and been able to transform. I really hope public agencies are able to take this and really being that public servant and really thinking how to adapt as quickly as possible. What we know is that we will be listening more deeply to our underrepresented and marginalized communities, and we will be delivering our services in new ways and different ways because the data has informed us where our needs are greatest, and now we are leading with our values. And so as our general manager at King County Metro, Terry White, likes to say, that we are data informed, but we are values driven. And so that is where I'm very excited to be part of the momentum and really providing that real change. Just want to point out the other thing that we've learned that we haven't talked about today is really how to work across an organization. We are working really closely with public health. I mean, we just never did that. We are actually delivering food on behalf of food banks to people. No longer people to the food banks. I mean, that transformation of how we're working with partners, not just employers, but social service providers, public health providers is so amazing. And I hope those relations and connections, because my understanding is that future is that cross-departmental agency work in different sectors is really going to bring that transformation. And Kelsey, I just want to end, you said, what is the future of funding public transportation? We got a lot of funding from the federal government and are very fortunate, but it only puts a small stop in the rushing water or the gap that's coming. We have a problem where we approved a budget through the King County Council. We will look at cutting our services in 2025. How far will this federal funding be able to fill that gap, and how much longer can we hold that is the question. But the demand is there. The need is there. And I'm so excited to hear from both of the panel representatives that they're in to really support the future of public transportation. And that will require funding it. And that will require us demonstrating as a public agency the value in being transparent and making sure we're looking at that long game together, how we're really improving our economy, helping clean up our environment, and really bringing communities together. That is going to be the future of how we kind of come around and build that partnership. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm feeling there's a lot to be excited about and optimistic about in terms of transit and our recovery. Richard, I love your interpretation of kind of reframing us around transportation as a means to live our lives. We shouldn't be living our lives around how we've planned transportation based on a map or on some schedules that may not be relevant to us anymore. Chris, I love to hear about that collaboration with public health. I'm a public health person and see, accessible, sustainable, affordable transportation as inherent and necessary as clean water and healthy food. We need it all to live our lives. So just have really appreciated this conversation. Okay, I'm going to turn to a few audience questions. I want to go back to the topic of safety. We talked about how there are some people, children, people who are immunocompromised who simply can't get vaccinated. Wondering, this question is about, is there overlap between these populations and transit-dependent populations? And what steps or practices around the nation, if any, are being taken to protect those folks that still want to safely take transit going forward, even in a post-COVID world? This person is wondering, will we keep masks for a longer period of time than this transition? Could there be mask-only sections on cars or trains? So how could some of these safety precautions really extend beyond? And I guess we could start with Chris V, if you've got information from around the country, or Chris O'Clair.
Yeah, I think masks really depend on the region. We've had some places where agencies have scarcely implemented a mask mandate, and some where there are people at your transit hub giving you a mask for free. So I think it's really important that we continue to find out what, at least for an agency locally, find out what people's perception of safety is, and make sure we're doing things to not only meet public health mandates, but also doing things to make sure that people just feel safe. It's really important that people wear masks because the public health agency says that. But for a transit agency, it's really important that riders feel safe because they see masks too. So that doesn't always follow the science necessarily, but it's a good way of making sure that people are going to come back to your transit vehicle because they think that they're not going to get sick. And we know they are tied together. So fortunately, it's not a lack of science there. So far as I think trying to segregate the mask list from people with masks going forward, I think that's going to be really hard. I think transit agencies have limited resources. I think we're already starting to see a squeeze with social distancing has made it harder to put as many vehicles as we need out. And some agencies, I believe MARTA is starting to relax that, and other places basically where the state government is allowing it, already starting to get rid of those distancing mandates because they really want to get more vehicles out, so they're not doing pass-ups, because a lot of pass-ups are happening in communities of color where people really need to get on the vehicle so they're not late to work. And so going forward, there's going to be like this need to make sure we're keeping up with the science and people are not getting sick, and making sure that things that some folks want to see are done, not. We don't want to overdo cleaning and social distancing going forward if it's no longer necessary, if it's going to impact our ability to give service to essential communities, basically.
The only thing I would add is that we as transit agencies are continuing to look at data. So there's a really good data question there that I heard. Is there an overlap between some of the immunocompromised and how does that overlay with some of our disadvantaged, even disabled communities, et cetera? That I don't know the answer to, but I think that's a really good question. We are committed to continue to find that overlap in that data to really understand where and how we deliver the services to those who really depend on us. But the question here, I think, is a little bit of how personally people can come to a service around safety. And we will always probably in the future see people in masks. I mean, I might always wear a mask on an airplane from here on out just because of the common flu. And we will always try to make sure we build a respectful environment where everyone is welcome to build their own safety into it. And then on top of that, we will continue to look at safety. So we are talking to our operators on how we continue these partitions, not just around COVID, but around spitting and other things that happen between the operator and customer at times. And really looking at how we maintain that cleanliness because the perception, as Chris said, is real, but also it's a public space. So we want to make it as inviting and welcome. We want to build that first class system that is so clean and so ready for everyone. So that future is a little bit unknown, but I know that we are going to always now look at it differently and commit resources at a greater extent than we ever did and try to be at the cutting edge with all our peer agencies. We spend a lot of time talking to our peer agencies on what they're doing and how they're making sure our safety is at the forefront for our customers and operators.
And I won't claim to have any expertise here that the Chris's haven't already shared, except to say that you know, I think we have a Transportation Choices Coalition, in fact, is really doing some cool leading work, as is KCM, on a broader question around safety in transit spaces with regard to who feels safe in transit, not just on a health basis, but with regard to public safety and law enforcement and disproportionate enforcement of fare requirements and all sorts of things. And so, you know, once again, we have the dovetailing of the many conversations that have been pushed to the forefront of our consciousnesses over the last year. And that I would be remiss if I didn't say that that's part of this conversation too, is law enforcement in transit spaces.
Yeah, Richard, thanks for taking us there. We did have a follow-up question about enforcement practices around mask wearing and distancing, and have there been penalties for non-compliance? Who is in charge of enforcing them? And then, of course, giant tie into how does that impact other interpretations of what makes transit safe?
Chris, do you want me to go? You want to go first?
I can take a shot. I think the enforcement part's difficult. We don't want to have, obviously, police intervention here. We've seen, even through the pandemic, just disproportionate enforcement on Black and brown people towards mask wearing. I think the model here has been to make sure that you have agents and stations, unarmed agents, customer service agents, giving out masks. So people that forgot them at home aren't going to have to worry about getting a ticket or having to talk to a police officer. Just be proactive about making sure people have masks on. Don't force the enforcement part of this.
So well said, Chris. And Richard, I really appreciate you bringing up this larger question of safety. We, King County Metro, are leading in with a Safe Reform initiative and really connecting with our community on to understand how to move forward to ensure that we have a safe system, but it is not built on a enforcement, but also just a kind of a criminal-based, downward generating, where we're not actually leading in with compassion and building up our community. We now at King County Metro are looking and leaning into how we can work with police in a different way, how we can actually communicate with customers, understand not just how to pass them a mask, but really understand how to give the ability for people to ride right. Who should get free passes? How should we enforce fares? And how can we make sure that a large percent of our population just just can't afford to ride. And a large percent of the population doesn't even have a safe, clean place to live right now. And our buses are very clean and very safe, and very welcoming. So how do we lean into that and work with our social service providers, our public health providers, and really understanding how we build up our community and build resources, as I described before, that connect across public agencies and providing and respecting the whole person, and where they need to be. I won't lie, this is complicated. This is has a lot of complexity around not just our customers, but our operators, right? And how we can ensure we build an environment where operators feel safe, but are safe, because there are incidences where we need to make sure that people are held accountable for their actions, and really how to do that and build that accountability at the same time. We are coming to our King County Council to engage in that conversation, and we welcome, as we do this, for others to connect with King County Metro, and we're going to be working with our partners, because this is not something we will solve alone. It's something we're going to have to work together on.
All right, I think I've got one last question from the audience. We know there's been a lot more. We're going to try to cull those and perhaps do a blog post answering more. But wondering, maybe Richard, thinking about shifts to working from home again, or perhaps like a hybrid model, and our interest in focusing on equity. Do you think internet connectivity and broadband infrastructure now must become a part of the transportation conversation? Is that part of our world now?
Yes. And let me figure out why. No, yes, because I mean, I think we're all living in this sort of peculiar outcome where maybe at the beginning of the pandemic we thought productivity, or maybe not productivity, the amount of things we have to do in a single day might have gone down from work from home, and that's exactly the opposite, right? There's no, we're not commuting. I don't move between one meeting and another. I don't have a meeting downtown at the, at Columbia Tower and then go back over to Expedia or home. It's all happening in one place, and it's all happening on internet that I pay for, by the way, Expedia. And so, yeah, I mean, I think absolutely there's an equity and there's a recovery question to be answered around digital equity. I mean, who has broadband access, who can afford broadband access, and what is the role of an employer to subsidize or provide that, or of a community, of a government. But also, I'll shout out the fact that one of the major drivers of our van pool program and of our shuttle program is Wi-Fi connectivity on those vehicles. Our folks, when they come into the office, if they're on a Expedia shuttle from Issaquah, they're spending an hour and 15 minutes. Either, if they're leaving late, or into the workday, they can take a meeting or do emails on their laptop, not just on their phone. If they're leaving early, they can listen to a podcast or watch the news or whatever. I mean, there's a new expectation around our personal connectivity that now, when we start going back into transit and transportation spaces, isn't going to go away overnight. And so, yes, absolutely, I think that internet connectivity is part of this.
Thank you so much. We all have to get to our next Zoom meetings at 4, so I think we're going to wrap it up there, but I wanted to, again, thank you to our panelists for spending this hour with us, and for all of the work that you are doing outside of this webinar. You are amazing. It's appreciated. Thank you, everyone, for attending. It is Ride Transit Month, and we have more events coming your way. We have transit trivia coming up next week. You can get a team together and play. It is a fun break from work and from the everyday. Very popular event. We also have a big rider celebration event coming up on June 30th. We're going to be telling those great rider stories and doing some fun transit activities. We'd love to have you join us. And finally, if you've been dying to know where these amazing, fun public transit t-shirts come from, they are still for sale. A portion of it does support Transportation Choices Coalition, which I obviously think is a very worthy cause, but most importantly, it spreads the gospel of how important it is for us to fund our public transit system wherever you are, we would love for you to take a photo with your shirt on near your transit system or your favorite bus stop and share it with us. And I think that's all for today. We hope that you stay in touch. If you had questions that we didn't get to, please feel free to reach out, and please take care. Thanks so much.